Right, we'll carry on then where we left off last time, looking at the historical background of the Laodicea church age. And today I'm hoping that we'll get as far as the 40s. We've looked at, we've looked back, tried to set Laodicea in the context of the 7 prophetic church ages, in that pattern, overall pattern of the restoration. In essence, it's the restoration of Jesus Christ to the church. The restoration of the full knowledge of Christ, the restoration of the Word, and the restoration of the Spirit that have been lost through the church ages and then step by step restored. And when we come to Laodicea, we have this, it really is a paradox, because Laodicea is an age, well, I think the simple way I would sum it up, it's an age of restoration and rebellion. It's an age when the Bible speaks of the falling away. It's an age when it speaks of things that are not good, and yet at the same time we will see the church being restored, they who are true, and there won't be many, but they who are true, restored to the original as it was given in the beginning. We'll look at how we reconcile those two another time in another study. But it is often people get confused between the idea of restoration and rebellion. The old way that I was brought up in the Pentecostal background was to look for an end time falling away, the love of many waxing cold, and all sorts of things that would not be good. And these things were biblically true. They're not untrue. But then there came another approach, and it swept away the falling away, and all of a sudden everything was being restored. And I went through that as well in the 70s and the 80s, especially in the UK. This concept of restorationism. And there's a lot of truth in that as well. What people find so difficult is that they're both true. And they don't even seem able to put them both together at the same time. But they do both go together. In the scriptures, all things will fit together. Anyway, we've looked a little bit last time at the early Laodicea period, 20th century, essentially, and up to date, up to the coming of the Lord. We looked at the continuation of the waves of evangelical awakenings and revivals that were taking place in the Philadelphia age, 18th, 19th century, and how the waves were sweeping over the same situation into the 20th century with the early revivals in various places, and in the famous Welsh revival, and then one that was different. The revivals till this time had been, how can I put it, doctrinally the doctrine was the same. It was a quickening and a bringing of new life, a quickening of doctrine that was already known, restored. But when you come to the Azusa Street revival, something else happened. It was something additional, a doctrinal additional step. They brought back a belief that the gifts of the Spirit and the baptism in the Spirit were still for the church today. And those things, or those teachings, have been lost for many, many centuries. In the Philadelphia age, they were starting to think again about them. When you look in the Sardis age, the Reformation, they specifically and explicitly taught the mainstream reformers that these gifts had finished. They were not for this day. The extraordinary gifts, as they called them, and the extraordinary ministries, apostle, prophet, and believe it or not, even the evangelist, which is why the Reformation age was not actually an evangelistic age. Very strange, but it was not. Because Philadelphia was the age of the open door, and evangelism, missionary, outreach. But the Reformation, for reasons that I certainly won't go into now, otherwise we'll get off on a tangent, but the Reformation was not in essence an evangelistic age. Right, anyway, the revival in Azusa Street in 1906 that went on, well, it's not as simple as this, but shall we just put it like this? There were meetings every day for 3 years until 1908. In that revival, many came to understand that these gifts and the baptism in the Spirit were for today. They were not for the days of the apostles and ending there. They were also for today. And the understanding that had begun to grow in the Philadelphia period. I'll give you an example. John Wesley. John Wesley did not, how can I say, teach the gifts of the Spirit as we would teach them today, but he did state in his diary that one time he believed that they had ended with the apostles, but he had come to realize that they had ceased because of the coldness of the church. And he actually encountered people who prophesied. But in those days, that was really avant-garde. And Wesley, you can feel sometimes being pulled two ways. Part of him believes in the principle of the gifts, but another part of him said, but we shouldn't be so proud as to think that we can have one. So they were caught in this this cleft stick. And the same thing goes through the 19th century. The gifts were, especially healing, was being talked about more and more, and people were praying for the sick more and more. It was quite controversial in those days, but nonetheless it was something that was becoming, I don't know what the right word would be, but almost common amongst the evangelical holiness groups that were going on in the ways of the Lord. There was a lot of opposition to it. I don't want to name the names, but there were very famous names that wrote strongly against gifts and healings because they had drunk so deep of the Reformation cup that all the gifts had finished with the apostles. The Reformation cup was actually the cup of Augustine of the 4th, 5th century. There we are, we won't go into that. But Azusa Street brought back a belief that these gifts were for today and the supernatural was for today and that men could experience these things today. And very soon, before the war, First World War, the Pentecostal message spread very, very widely over across all the globe. Now, when I look at Laodicea, historically, I will focus a lot on the Pentecostalism, and I'll focus a lot on the US. And that's not because there's nothing else to talk about or nowhere else to talk about. It's not because other parts of the world and other situations are not important, but these were the crucial, these were the focal points, these were the key issues in the Laodicea age. If I can put it like this, when you look at the Reformation, there are a lot of things you could talk about, but we focus on the Reformers. There are many other things you could talk about if you wanted to. There's an awful lot of other things happening, but we focus on the Reformers, on Luther and Calvin and the British, English Reformation and so on. When you come to Wesley's age, you focus on the Methodists and the teaching that they brought of holiness and sanctification and how that teaching spread. So in the age of the Reformers, really the key area was continental Europe. Yes, it affected our country, Britain, but the key area was continental Europe. When you come to the Wesleyan age, the key area was England. And in those days, and I believe it was part of the divine plan, it's nothing to do with nationalism, Britannia ruled the waves. Why? Because she took the word out to the ends of the earth. She used her navy, or when the British Navy controlled the waves, the British missionaries were going to the ends of the earth, into all sorts of countries, taking the Bible everywhere. The Lord knows how to use people in his own ways. He raises up and he brings down whom he will. So in those days, the focal point was often on England especially. By the 19th century, in the late 19th century, it was moving more to the United States, and by the 20th century, the key influence in religious affairs was America. Not England so much, not Europe so much, but America. and it remains the case today, that what happens in the religious scene in America will go worldwide very, very quickly in this day of modern communication. So I'm focusing on what happens in America because it really is what happens in Britain and what happens in Europe and what happens on the mission field as well. And I'm focusing on the Pentecostal developments, Pentecostalism in all its sort of manifold expressions. Became the charismatic movement by the 60s, and then later, some may not know this term, but there came what came to be known as the third wave. We'll worry about what these terms mean later. For the moment, let's just stay with the early Pentecostals. The early Pentecostals, how can I say, this is the first wave. The early Pentecostalism spread dramatically. I gave you some of the stories of how it spread across the United States, and then it spread to other countries and other places. The war intervened, First World War, and it was a world war. It did sort of intervene with things, but it didn't stop things, because almost as soon as the war finished, by 1919, although there were many terrible things that took place, we know about the war itself, and we also, many will remember that something that killed more than the war, the flu, that came the year afterwards, and it was a worldwide flu. It was dramatic in its effects, but that's another thing. But at the same time, there was something else happening, and the belief in the supernatural, the belief in the gifts, the belief in praying for the sick and things like this had been was spreading quite dramatically. People were being filled with the Spirit, and some were taking it to the mission field, and some were taking it to the homelands. In the United Kingdom, you had George and Stephen Jeffreys having crusades all over the nation. You had Smith Wigglesworth, who actually spent more time overseas. He went to the Americas, or America, and then also he spent a lot of time in New Zealand, and he went to other places ministering and preaching, Sweden, Switzerland, preaching and praying for the sick. We have people like Charles Price. He was a sort of Calvinistic background, and he was thoroughly converted from modernism. He was a preacher actually, but he was a modernist, and he came to the Lord, and he was filled with the Holy Ghost and began to preach, praying for the sick all over North America. We have others. The Pentecostal message throughout the 20s was spreading and spreading and expanding. But I don't want you to get the wrong impression. It was spreading and expanding, but it was not anything like, numerically, what it is today. Nothing at all like it. But it was spreading quite dramatically. That was the 20s. But something the life started to drain when you come to the 30s. Politically or economically, if you want to put it like that, we come to the period of the Great Depression, and that was a worldwide thing. So money was in a terribly short supply. It affected the world, the civilized world, or what should I call it, the first world, and the other parts of the world as well. So this certainly had an effect, but it was not the only thing. There was something else. The early Pentecostals had lost something. They started to move, instead of being so focused on the life of the Spirit that they had experienced, and carrying that life and taking that life, they started to think more about how they should organize their meetings, and how they should organize their fellowships, and so on and so forth. And they started to form denominations. In the UK, we had Elim. The Elim Foursquare Alliance was formed by the Jeffreys brothers, George Jeffreys especially, George Jeffreys. And then the Assemblies of God were formed. They took a different line. They didn't join Elim because they wanted more local church government, and so the Assemblies of God were focused more, not the only issue, but more on local church government. Elim was more a sort of for want of a word, I think the best word would be a sort of a Presbyterian type of government. And then there was the apostolic movement, and the apostolic were focused on divine government, what they would call divine government. Apostles and prophets ruled and governed the church, and it was governed, ruled and led by prophecy, and that caused an awful lot of antagonism. So there were three movements in the UK, and increasingly they were really focused on their forms of government and spent an awful lot of time devising it, writing constitutions, making sure that they were legally watertight, and so on and so forth. And I won't go into all the details, but dear me, they did spend an awful lot of time, and they spent a lot of time arguing about it. And something was going of the spiritual. They were losing what shall I say, the experience of the gifts was beginning to decline. Prophecy, tongues, healings. In fact, when you come to the 40s, the mid-40s, it's said, I don't know who went and counted them, but it's said that 90% of Pentecostals had never seen a miracle, which is stunning when you think that is why the Pentecostal movement began. Now, as I say, I don't know who counted them, but that's what's said. There's certainly there's a truth in it, and anyway, let's leave that. The same thing was happening in the United States. You get different groups, the Assemblies of God, not connected with the British Assemblies of God. The Assemblies of God in America was formed, and they sort of it was a loose umbrella arrangement, but there was a major split in the second decade of the 20th century between those who believed in baptizing in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and those who didn't. And in fact the movement split. There was a major split, and 1/3 of the, shall I just loosely call it, the Assemblies of God separated and formed various other churches that later on many of them amalgamated and formed what's called today the United Pentecostal Church, which was, well, the common term is Jesus only or oneness. The Assemblies of God were strongly Trinitarian, and there was great antagonism and tension between the two movements. There were other issues, there were many other issues actually, but there were many different Pentecostal groups that sprung up. There was the big one, major one, was the Church of God, which had a very strong emphasis on strong central government, strong central control. There's a lot of little breakaways from the Church of God, a multitude of names. There was the Foursquare, what do they call it now, I can't remember, the International Foursquare Alliance, I think, over in Amy Semple McPherson, over in California. There was the Pentecostal Holiness Church, that's where Oral Roberts came from, that's where it was his original church. And a number of other ones, and each one in their own way have emphases and different things, but unfortunately it wasn't just that they formed fellowships. There was a lot of control, increasing control over the churches, a lot of division and tension between the churches, so that Pentecostals weren't actually talking to one another if you weren't a devout group. So we now find a situation when they haven't got what they used to have. Things were changing. They were getting worried, not worried, concerned about buildings. They were concerned about the forms of worship and the order of worship. The spontaneity was going, the life, the spirit, the anointing, the atmosphere. You've got to sort of organise it if it doesn't come. If it's not there, you try and organise it to sort of show you've still got it, but you haven't. Because the very fact you've got to organise it shows that you haven't. But that's what was going on. There was so the gifts were being less in evidence. When you come to the 40s, the gifts were less in evidence. The healing was. Let's take healing for a minute. In the 20s, there were many healing evangelists. You know some of the famous ones: George Jeffreys, Smith Wigglesworth, Charles Price, F.F. Bosworth. and there were others. By the 30s, you'll find that many of these ministries had actually stopped. George Jeffrey's last major church crusade that opened a church was 1934. After that, he was still around, but after that you didn't have the big crusade. It just wasn't having the effect anymore. The atmosphere wasn't there. The spirit wasn't there in the same way that it had been. You could look at F.F. Bosworth. He used to hold many crusades in America on the road, but when he then had to change because the money wasn't there because of the Great Depression. So he went on to radio evangelism, and he did continue that for a long time, but in the end, by I think it was the late 30s, he finished that ministry. Things weren't as they used to be, and those who remembered the original and the beginning knew there was something missing. The later ones didn't, because they were the second generation. But the first generation knew there was something missing. Something wasn't there that used to be there, and they tasted it, and so they knew the difference. You couldn't con them the way that the second generation, they never tasted it, so they didn't know the difference. I mean, what they had was probably pretty good compared with what else was around, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't like it was at the beginning. So you could look at other issues, you could look at other people, you could look at other ministries, but you'll find this. I mean, one of the things I often say about the British Pentecostal scene, when you come to the 30s, they spend more time discussing forms of church government and writing the histories of their movements. Whenever things are moving fast, you ain't got time to write histories. You are the history. The history is the present, and that's what's going on. But once things are not as they used to be, you'll find it's normal in all church history. You start writing histories about it rather than having a present. Anyway, I know that oversimplifies things. I know you'll find ways to, how can I say, to contradict that general principle, but the general principle holds anyway. Let's move on. And let's come to the 40s. By the time you come to the 40s, there was a growing hunger for something that used to be there, and it wasn't there the same way. The hunger was growing either amongst those who used to have it, or those who had heard about it from some who had it, and something inside them witnessed to it and wanted it. You know, it's like, if we read the stories of the past, we weren't there. We weren't around then. We're not old enough to have been around then. But something about them quickens you. There's something in you that pulls you. There's something in you that brings a groan out of you. Not a miserable groan either. The kind of groan it says in Romans 8. When you groan within. What for? The redemption of the body. You're groaning within for what lies in the future and the glory. And this kind of groaning, there's a groaning within to taste what we read about even in the church histories, and there was something growing. It was growing by the end of the 30s. There were people who were very hungry for these things at the same time as the more formal was gradually coming in, step by step, little by little. You couldn't say that the whole movement was one thing or another. Individual churches were different. They progressed differently. So in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the longing continued to see a renewal of the healings and the gifts that were now disappearing amongst Pentecostal people. And this is all this is what happened in the early church. They were gradually disappearing. And the first group, they don't say they didn't exist anymore, they were only for the apostles. But when you go 2 or 3 generations on, that's when they start saying, well, they're not for us anyway. But we've reached a stage when, I mean, I've often said this, it stuns me. I've gone around lay preaching for years. I have ministered in no end of churches all over the place and all over different parts of the country. And whenever I'm in a Pentecostal church, firstly I'm listening for the gifts, and then I ask about the gifts. And it stuns me what I hear or don't hear, and what the answers to the questions are. You go and you say, we don't have gifts of the Spirit, we haven't had them for X number of years. We don't see these things. And it amazes me, in churches that have the sign Pentecostal outside, they don't have it inside. But something was missing. The pre-war generation was passing, the ones that had actually, if you like, Joshua's generation. Those that Joshua had died, and those who knew the ministry of Joshua, those elders who knew his ministry, kept the life going in the days of Joshua. Well, they were dying off. In fact, within, I think, I may be wrong, I think it was within a week of one another, and I don't think it is a coincidence. Our lives are in his hands. Charles Price and Smith Wigglesworth died. If it wasn't within a week of one another, it was with a very short time of one another, in 47. And I don't find that without significance. The previous generation was going. There was a new generation coming. Something else was coming. Smith Wigglesworth and Charles Price were associated with the healing ministry of the pre-war, if you like, the first wave. The first wave of Pentecostalism that came, that started with Azusa Street. There was sort of a hiccup with the war, First World War. Not so much in America, because America, there wasn't fighting in America, was there? Troops went in 1917 to Europe, but it wasn't the same in America. So, you know, people could continue to minister in a more normal way. And so Pentecostalism was spreading and spreading, but by the 30s the momentum had gone in many places, and people were starting to look back rather than to look. They were saying what we used to have rather than what we've got, and let's keep going and progressing on. Then it happened. They weren't going to be disappointed. If I can find the scripture, I hope I can find it. I think it's Isaiah 40, is it 43? Yes. Isaiah 43, verse 18. Remember ye not the former things, neither consider the things of old. Behold, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Ye shall not know it. Shall ye not know it? I will even make a way in the wilderness, and rivers in the desert. The beasts of the field shall honour me, and the dragons and the owls, because I give waters in the wilderness, and rivers in the desert, to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people that I have formed for myself. This is my point. This is the different situation. The situation in the passage I read is this. The Lord's saying this. Listen, you look back to what I did in the past. Rightly. You should. I want you to look back and remember what I did in the past. And what did I do in the past? The former things. Verse 18, the former things. What are those former things? Well, in the former things were that I opened the Red Sea. You remember those things. I opened the sea. You remember the miracles of the days of Moses. But I'm going to do a new thing. Behold, this is the context, is you're going to go into Babylon, but I'll bring you back out. Behold, I will do a new thing. And now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? You will certainly know what I do. I will bring you back. And I won't go into any more details about that. This is the key thing I want to do. You won't be saying what I did in the days of Moses because of what I'm doing today. That will catch you. A time was coming when they wouldn't be saying what happened in Azusa Street. They wouldn't be saying what happened when Charles Price was on the field. They wouldn't be saying what happened when Smith Wigglesworth was on the field. They wouldn't be saying what happened when George Jeffreys was on the field, when there were queues of a quarter of a mile long outside the meetings waiting to get in. Huge queues waiting to go into the Albert Hall. They won't be saying about these things anymore, because I will do a new thing. And this will outshine the old. It says in the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 126, I hope. Psalm 126 verse 6, we shall see. This is about the rivers, by the rivers of Babylon. The children of Israel yes. The children of Israel were in Babylon. They didn't have, they remembered what they used to be and what they used to have. And then it says this, Psalm 126 verse 1, when the Lord turned again the captivity of Zion, we were like them that dream. And that's where some of these hungry people were saying, Lord, bring back what we used to have. We haven't got it the way we used to have it. Things aren't what they used to be. Things aren't like they used to be in days of old. Didn't Gideon say, well, if the Lord is with us, where are the miracles then? Where are these things that we used to have in the days of old? Well, then it happened. There came a revival starting in America. Sudden, astonishing force, and on a scale beyond anything that had ever been known up till this time. The successes of all the earlier healing evangelists were dwarfed. Public prayer for the sick was revived, but on a scale hitherto unknown. A numerically unparalleled period of mass evangelism began in North America, with vast interdenominational crowds exceeding those of the previous generation. And the impact of that revival wasn't only in America, but it went worldwide. This was the second wave. The first wave was Azusa Street. Another wave was coming, but this was a tsunami. The first one was a wave, and it was a blessed wave, but there was a tsunami that was coming, a spiritual tsunami. The revival begun in 1946, and it ran on until 1956. It was in two phases really, from 46 to 52, and that was really it crested in 52. 52 was the pinnacle, the high point. And then 53 to 56, it was still going well, but by 57, it was generally acknowledged by all who were involved in it that the revival was over. Let's look at it. I don't know how far we'll get. We might get to 47. We'll see how far we get. But we'll start with the cloudburst, 46:7. How did it start? It was sudden. It just erupted with an astonishing force. These are the words of observers, those who saw it. They were stunned. And the words of people who saw what happened in the previous days and who hadn't lost it. But they were stunned by what took place. They were amazed. More than anything else, the renewed interest in healing, the revival, began with a man called William Branham, a young missionary Baptist preacher from Jeffersonville, Indiana. Missionary Baptist is a smallish Baptist group, not like the Southern Baptist is the main one, when you think of Baptist in America, really it's a Southern Baptist you usually mean. But the Missionary Baptist was a smaller group. We won't worry about the reasons for them being separate, but that's where he belonged, to this group in the hilly-billy country, the Appalachian Mountains. What happened? Why was it significant? Because of the visit of an angel. people may hesitate today. We have many, what shall I say, firstly some doubt the supernatural full stop, and secondly many doubt because they have met so much nonsense. My simple reply is this: there may be scarecrows all over the place, just walk past them, because you will only find a fake £5 note and a fake £10 note and a fake £20 note and a fake 50. You won't find a fake £19 note, you won't find a fake £7 note, and you won't find a fake £29 note, because there isn't the real thing. If there are scarecrows, they're pointers to the real thing. Somewhere there's a real thing. Angels do visit people. The Bible says so. Before the Lord's first coming, who came to visit Zacharias? An angel. Who came to visit Mary? An angel. I'm deliberately staying in the New Testament because in the Old Testament the examples will usually be the angel of the Lord, which is a little different. And I'm going to the New because it is an angel, but it's not the angel of the Lord. It's a little different. It was an angel from the Lord, but it's not the angel of the Lord. What about Joseph? I know with him it was in a dream, but who visited him in his dream? An angel, and spoke to him. What about Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 when he was praying? The centurion, an angel appeared to him in a vision. Just like Zacharias, they perceived that Zacharias had had a vision. He was awake, he was alert, he wasn't asleep. It wasn't a vision of the night, it was in the day. But it's called a vision because you saw the spiritual world and the supernatural world. And that's what happened to this brother. And the vindication and the proof of it is that what was said happened. In May 1946, because he wanted to seek the Lord, there were things that were disturbing him. Brother Branham, that's how he was commonly known by his those who knew him, so that's the expression I'll use. Brother Branham, he went out into a cave, a place where he used to go to pray, hidden away, way out in the wilderness. And there he spent time in prayer, and while he was in that cave, his testimony is this, that an angel came to him in that cave. And what did the angel do? What did the angel say? The angel had a message, something to say to him. He told him several things. Firstly, that the Lord had called Brother Branham to bring a gift of divine healing to the world. To bring healing unto the world. Secondly, if he was sincere and got the people to believe, not even cancer would stand before his prayers. And in those days, I mean, cancer is not a small thing today, but in those days cancer really was a big fear, and they didn't have the medical situations that we have today. So cancer really was a fear of many people. Then he was told he would preach before multitudes. You've got to remember, he's a backwoodsman. He's from, you know, the hilly-billy country, from an insignificant part of America. He certainly hadn't preached before multitudes. He would preach before multitudes, he would preach all over the world, and he would pray for kings and potentates, rulers. And this was an indifferent man, a man with no significance in the world's eyes or the religious world's eyes. Then he was told that his commission, that he came from the Lord, would be vindicated with signs in the same way that Moses. After all, people might well say to him, who do you think you are? You must have had a bad dream, or you must have eaten too much last night. And as it says in Ecclesiastes, if you know, you'll get some dreams if you do that kind of thing. So prove it. Well, what happened when Moses was sent to the children of Israel and he said, I've come to deliver you? Didn't look too likely, did it? He didn't come with an army. He didn't even come with a machine gun. He just turned up. All he had was a word. And but he was given also 2 signs. And it says this in Exodus 4, 8 and 9. The voice of the sign. It said in Exodus 4, when the Lord was speaking to Moses, I will give you 2 signs. One of them, you put your hand inside by your breast and put it back out, and it will be leprous, put it back in, and the leprosy will be gone. And the other one, you throw your rod on the floor, it will turn into a snake, you pick it up by the tail, and it will turn back to a rod. Miracles indeed. And then, well, we'll come to the next one in a minute. And the angel said, I will give you 2 signs. The first one is this. When you take the right hand of those that you pray for, if a germ disease is present, you will feel a vibration and a swelling in your hand, and you would know what the disease was. And if the disease were healed, then the effect on his hand would go. Secondly, this is what the angel said, if they don't believe the first one, I'll give you a second one. It's exactly what the Lord said to Moses. If they don't believe the first sign, the voice of the first sign, then you have a second sign, and they'll believe the voice of the second sign, for signs have a voice. These are not just meant to be miracles. Miracles are signposts. Miracles are pointing somewhere. They're pointing to something. They're to direct your attention to something. You don't spend your time looking at the signpost. You spend your time going in the direction that the signpost is pointing you. That is the issue. That's the reason for the sign. And the second one will be that you will know the secrets of the hearts. In fact, the angel said, tell the people this, that what they think speaks louder in heaven than what they say. You will know the secrets of the heart, and you will know what men are thinking, the thoughts of the heart. And then, if I could read from Exodus 4, there was a third thing said. Exodus 4, this is what was said to Moses. Exodus 4 and verse 8. It shall come to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, that they will believe the voice of the latter sign. Verse 9, and it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these 2 signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it upon the dry land, and the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land. Now, don't get confused. That's one of the miracles, isn't it? Water turning to blood. But that's not the context here. The context here is this. What will happen if they don't receive the word that I send? The land will be covered in blood. And the angel said, if these signs, to Brother Branham, if these signs are not received, as with Moses in Egypt, blood would come upon the earth. But if he were faithful, the results of his ministry would reach to the whole world and shake the nations. You're talking to a backwoodsman from the middle of nowhere, from a place that nobody's heard of, and a man that nobody's heard of. What kind of, the man must be out of his mind, surely. In fact, when he went back after the angel had spoken to him, one more thing. Finally, the angel told him that his commission and his gifts were a sign of the second coming. Those gifts, there's something about those gifts that indicate the coming of Jesus is near. We won't look into that now, but there's something about the gifts. It's not just because they were gifts, but there's something about those gifts that are pointing to the nearness of the coming of Jesus Christ. How? In what way? Well, I'll leave the thought in your mind for now. But when he came back, he went to see, I don't know what the right word is, the man who was his sort of, superintendent or something, or had been his superintendent in the Missionary Baptist Church. And he went to speak to this brother, and he told the brother what had happened to him, and the brother said he had too much to eat and he'd had some bad dreams and so on, and who on earth is going to listen to you, and so on and so forth. So he said the kind of things that any, what would I say, anyone who doesn't, is not used to these supernatural matters would probably think. But every part of it happened. And that's the vindication of it. Every part of it happened. What was said? Let me go back again. Let me remind myself. Firstly, he would take a gift of healing. And that's what began. His ministry brought healing to an extent that had never been seen by any ministry, either from the Pentecostal times or since the days of the early church. Secondly, he would take it to the world. How on earth was he going to go to the world? He'd hardly been around his own state, never mind going to the world. He would go to kings and to potentates, pray for kings and potentates. Well, he did, that's another thing. What else was said? He would be given 2 gifts. Indeed, those gifts are now, well, they're undeniable. There's literally tens of thousands of people who've seen those gifts in operation, so there's no question whether they happened or not. Those signs certainly happened. And the results did reach the whole world and shake nations. And his prayers, even cancer did not stand before his prayers, because sometimes, even visibly before the whole congregation, the cancers would physically drop from people's bodies, from maybe from their neck, from their nose. One had one on the nose, and it just fell off because of the power of the presence of the Lord at those times. Well, very soon afterwards, Brother Branham went back to his home little church, a small church that he had in Jeffersonville, and while he was there, he was telling his church what had happened to him in the cave when the angel came. Well, while the meeting was in process, a telegram arrived for him, and I don't know if you remember telegrams. I do. I'm old enough to remember them, and telegrams really were important things, you know. You only send a telegram for an important thing, and he had a telegram that arrived, and it was brought into him in the meeting, and it was almost a vindication of what he'd been told by the angel, because the telegram asked him, would you please come urgently to St. Louis and pray for, it was a pastor from a UP, United Pentecostal Church, and he said, would you come and pray for my daughter? She's 7 and she's in agony with a problem. We don't know what it is, and we prayed for her for days, and she's no improvement, and she's writhing around in pain. Please, please, please come and pray for her. And Brother Branham went there, and she was healed in a remarkable way. Not just healed, but the visions and the exact precision of the visions that Brother Branham saw that led to her healing, led to the pastor saying, will you come back and hold a crusade in my town? And so he had a 10-day crusade there. The first day was just like Evan Roberts when the Welsh Revival began in Lucca. He asked to speak to the youth group, and the Lord had spoken to Evan Roberts when he was in his place of prayer, and the Lord told him to go back to Lucca, his hometown, and there in his home church to ask to speak to the young people. And he asked that, and he was given permission to do that for a week or two. And the first night was quite uneventful, quite sort of ordinary. When you think of it, this is the Welsh Revival, and it started on an ordinary, uneventful, uninspiring meeting that you just went home afterwards from. Well, Brother Branham went there, they put a big tent up, and just I think there was only about 20 people there. You know, wasn't exactly an inspiring start. Mind you, a bit different from the meeting I just described to you, because the testimonies of healing were such that very soon the tent was so full they couldn't get everybody in. It was crammed with people. And he prayed in that meeting for 1,000 people. And the first sign gift was in operation. There he would know if they had a germ disease, and he would know what that disease was. And people's faith, they'd never seen anything the likes of this. This had never been seen before, this kind of ministry. This was remarkable. Despite the small beginnings, reports of remarkable healings soon filled the tent. I could give you many details, but I daren't, because we'll never get beyond 1947. We've got to get to today, eventually. But the police had to control the crowds, and that became a common thing, a normal thing in the Crusades that were to come. But let's not run too far ahead. This was the beginning of a ministry that, and this is no exaggeration, many times preachers destroy their credibility by exaggerating. This was the beginning of a ministry that was unparalleled in all recorded church history. As the angel predicted, and I'll say that several times, as the angel told him, as he said in his church before it happened, as he said to his missionary Baptist supervisor before it happened, as the angel said, it sparked off a worldwide revival. A hilly-billy from nowhere. An invitation soon followed. The word was getting around on the grapevine. He didn't have great advertising budgets, but never mind. When the real thing's there, you don't need one. The advertising will be done by the people who went to the first one, and they'll be telling it, and it'll get down. They'll be on the phone, and did you know, and have you heard, and I saw this, and so on. The advertising worked remarkably, and he soon had an invite to a place called Camden, in not North London, no, in Arkansas, and there it was remarkable. The scene was described there in the hall. I've forgotten the hall. It wasn't a church hall. Anyway, whatever the hall was. There, coming through the entrance hall, they saw, people were stunned. A whirling ball of fire came through the entrance hall and gradually made its way down the aisle, hovering, not on the floor level, but hovering, moving down the aisle. People were screaming, people were fainting. They'd never seen this. Dear me, isn't this one on the day of Pentecost? Isn't this what we see when in Ezekiel chapter 1, he saw that great whirling fire, the whirlwind, he saw it coming and coming and coming. It was the glory of God that was coming. The glory of God was coming into the room. The whirling circle of fire appeared at the entrance, moving down the aisle. People were screaming and fainting. It went past a crippled Baptist minister in his wheelchair. He just jumped out of his chair and pushed the chair down the aisle, shouting and praising the Lord, because that was old-fashioned Baptist. I don't quite know if these were Southerners. It's a bit different sometimes. Anyway, but he was praising the Lord, and the light came, and the light then was hovering over Brother Branham's head, and a photographer, a Baptist man actually, he came and he photographed the picture. And that picture can be seen by anybody who wants to see it. But when the pastor of the church, he approached the fire, he fell back temporarily, blinded. He couldn't approach it. He couldn't approach it. The presence and the life of God, holy things were in that meeting. Well, dear me. There were remarkable healings. Again, healings, people had never seen things. Firstly, don't forget what I said to you, 90% of Pentecostals, whoever counted them, had never seen a miracle. Well, they were seeing them then. They were seeing astonishing things. They were seeing unbelievable. They knew these were miracles. You get all the miserable skeptics that are coming along. Why is it that these people who say they pray for the sick and they're healed, why is it never something you can see? It was a pain in the head, or it was a pain in the neck, but it's always something you can't see. Well, they certainly had plenty to see in these meetings. They certainly had plenty to see. The Baptist man who took the photo of the light, he came to see Brother Branham afterwards. He said, "Brother, how do I get what you've got?" He said, "I've never seen anything like this before." He said, I don't know anything about this kind of life. I wasn't brought up that way. Well, invitations quickly followed. You can get many details, but I daren't go into the details here now myself. But you get many details in different books that will recount what happened. But many invitations followed Remember, the first brother who invited Brother Branham after the visit of the angel was a United Pentecostal pastor. And he invited Brother Branham to preach in his UP church. Then the invitation to Camden was UP, and then a number of other UP church pastors were asking Brother Branham, and it went through now, we're talking, where are we now? We're into mid-46 to mid-47. So over the next 12 months or so, he was preaching in many services organised by the United Pentecostal people. There were thousands attending the meetings, people who came to the meetings from, often you'd find there'd be more people attending the meeting than what lived in the place where the meeting would be held. You would find there would be no hotel rooms available, people had to sleep in their cars or whatever, if they came in a car, if they had one. Police escorts were needed to get Brother Branham into the meeting. He couldn't even get in to his own meeting because the crowds were so great. Many is a time when, well, he usually prayed until after 2 a.m. in the morning for the sick. In one 8-day meeting, he never left the pulpit once, even eating and sleeping in the pulpit. The crowds were unspeakable. This was, George Jeffreys saw things. Smith Wigglesworth saw thousands in Sweden, in the capital city, and in Switzerland. Charles Price saw thousands. They'd never seen anything like this. This outstripped anything that had been seen in America in the healing evangelism ministry. And he was different from many of the people that Americans had grown used to. He was conscious from the very beginning of money, or the curse of money, and what money can do. I mean, I don't know who will listen to this, so I hope it doesn't insult anybody, but when I was a young Christian, I remember my pastor told me that they viewed America as the preacher's graveyard for British preachers. Why? Because so many British preachers wanted to go to America. Why? Because they got better paid. Was it the call of God, or was it the call of the salary? Which one called them? Well, Brother Branham was conscious from the very beginning. In fact, when he first accepted the commission of the angel, that the angel told him that the Lord had for him, he said, I will go and I will now evangelize and pray for the sick wherever you lead me, as long as you provide the money that I need, but I will never ask for it. He would never ask for money in his services. In fact, managers were replaced later because they wanted to ask for money, and he refused it. His managers ended up with an awful lot more money than he ever had. He took as a salary what a normal Pentecostal pastor would have. When he went, he didn't stay in a 5-star hotel in the the presidential suite. He would stay in a really down market type of boarding place that really was a squash. He was conscious that money can destroy. The Bible says that in 1 Timothy chapter 6. One day, after someone was healed, I can't remember who it was, but a brother, he came up and he gave to Brother Branham a check for $1.5 million because one of his family had been healed. And he wouldn't even take it out of his hands. He said, I can't take this. I didn't heal your family member. The Lord healed him. It's not mine. And he refused to have it. Another man, he came with a check for $25,000, and I don't know how it got into Brother Branham's hand, but he took it and then he just tore it up and refused to take it with the same reply. And it wasn't the only time that kind of thing happened. He was also renowned for his humility. One of the things about Brother Branham that endeared him even to his enemies, he was gentle, his gentle, quiet and outstandingly humble spirit. He was renowned for this. It often contrasted sharply with the flamboyance and the boisterous showmanship and the approach of many of the later evangelists that followed. Well, one thing is for certain. They knew that he had the real thing. And the testimonies, there are many, many testimonies. When Brother Branham's ministry burst onto the scene, it was awe-inspiring, and again I'll say, without parallel outside the New Testament. There is nowhere in any recorded part of church history where you will find anything that even approaches the ministry that took place in these days. It was awe-inspiring. There had never been gifts and a ministry like it in the annals of recorded history. Often he would have 30 to 40 visions a day of what would happen in the services or future incidents. Many, many details. Far, far too many to mention. But the testimonies that backed up his ministry are many. I'll give you one or two. I'll give you first of all a couple from people who worked with him, fellow labourers if you like. Gordon Lindsay, he was one of Brother Branham's early managers. He helped him in his early ministry, organising meetings. And he said this, he saw Gordon Lindsay organise a group of healing evangelists called the Voice of Healing Group. And there were about 100 of them. And so he'd seen many miracles, many things. And he said this. He said that the miracles of Brother Branham, they were unsurpassed. No one else saw what they saw in the ministry of Brother Branham. They were stunning. I mean, at one time, at the very beginning of the meeting, they would ask for those with the hardest illnesses to come forward first. They would ask for people who were born blind, people who were born deaf, people who were born dumb. Bring those up at the very beginning, and they were the first ones healed, so that the people could have faith. But shall we just say lesser things later on? How different from the approach of some who are deceivers and dishonest, and they will have their people who will come out and pretend that they're sick. They will come out and be prayed for and pretend that they've been healed, and then they will go away. It's all been set up and arranged by some professed evangelist. And the reason or the justification, so-called, that they give for this dishonesty is, well, it's rising the faith of the people. They think this person been healed, so their faith arises. They didn't need it in these kind of meetings, because the real thing was happening. But Ern Baxter, he was another man who was a manager for Brother Branham for a period of years between 47 and 53, and he said this. People, when they came out to be prayed for, often they would bring with them a little card, and on the card they wrote down what their illness was, and they would give that to Ern Baxter, and then they would go to Brother Branham. And Ern Baxter would said that every time what Brother Branham discerned by the anointing was exactly what was on the card. It was spot on. Well, there was one example that it wasn't, but it was. One clergyman came out and he thought he would show up this deception. And so he wrote on a card, I have got TB and something else that I can't remember. And he gave this card in, and then he went to be prayed for by Brother Branham. And Brother Branham looked at him, very puzzled, and he said, I'm sorry, brother. He said, there's nothing wrong with you. And the clergyman turned round to the congregation and he said, there we are, I told you it was deception. On my card is TB. And he said, I haven't got it, and something else. And then the anointing came, and it's a solemn thing to play with holy things. Because Brother Branham said, Sir, you came without TB, but you will go with it. He fell on the floor on his knees, crying out, please, 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 holding his trouser leg, please. He said, I can't sort it out. You have to sort it out with God. It's God who said what I've said. These are serious things. This is not vindictiveness. The Lord dealt in that way. What about Brother Bosworth? Brother Bosworth, F.F. Bosworth, he was a veteran healing evangelist. I don't remember his exact age, but he was actually retired and in his 70s when he began to help Brother Branham in his ministry. It's the best way to retire. Don't worry about the cruise. You can have a cruise in the world to come. There might be no more sea, but there'll be water. Brother Bosworth was a veteran healing evangelist who had prayed for the sick for over 30 years before the war. He received over 250,000 prayer requests over his radio ministry, and he said he had over 200,000 written testimonies of those who were healed under his ministry. So he knew what he was talking about. He had a background, and this is what he said. He said, I have never seen, heard or read of people born blind receiving their sight, or of anything to equal the healing ministry of William Branham. Furthermore, he said, the success of his discernment and visionary ministry is exactly 100%. Time and again, when F.F. Bosworth was convening, he would say that there'd never been a ministry like this since the days of that the Lord walked the earth. Never in the history of the church had God come to work in this way. People would see things that no one had seen since the days that Jesus walked the earth. Remarkable things. When Brother Branham was in South Africa in, I can't remember, is it 52? I think it was 1952. There was a brother, his name was J.H. Grobler. He was the only full-time healing evangelist, Pentecostal healing evangelist in South Africa for many years. And this is what he said. He was stunned when he saw the operation of the gifts that Brother Branham had, diagnosing diseases and discerning the secrets of the hearts. You could list testimony after testimony, but even those who had reservations and were cautious. Here's one. Even they had to acknowledge the undeniable accuracy of his ministry. Referring to his use of the word of knowledge, by which he indicated diseases often and other things, with remarkably accurate details, Donald G., big important man in the UK Pentecostal scene, and the world Pentecostal scene as well for the period after the war, he said, it seems impossible to deny something of the Spirit of God in his ministry. He reported that he had received an impressive number of entirely separate testimonies from reliable eyewitnesses concerning the miraculous result of Brother Branham's campaigns. Another man, Walter Hollenweger, which you've probably never heard of. He was a professor of ecumenical studies in the University of Birmingham. He actually was a Swiss man. He was a Swiss pastor, Swiss Pentecostal pastor. And what happened, the time came when he was interpreting in a meeting that was held by Brother Branham. And he said this. He was the interpreter, don't forget. So when people came up and Brother Branham would say to them, brother, you know, your sickness is, and whatever it was, and what happened was when you were a child something happened, and he would describe the scene of what happened. What this man said was every single thing that Brother Branham said was accurate and reliable. It happened. And yet he was a modernist, because he left the Pentecostal church. He became a modernist, and as a modernist he gave that testimony of what he had experienced. So he certainly wasn't someone who was there, you know, he was blind and he was, he could only, he got stars in his eyes and so on and so forth. Well, where do I stop? And where do I think what I'd better do, I think I'd better stop there now, because we've had a fair amount. So I'll cut it off and we'll carry on. We'll see the effect of this ministry. It's not just Brother Branham's ministry, we'll see the effect of this ministry on America and then worldwide, and we'll see how it was the ministry of William Branham that brought the second wave of Pentecost that swept the whole globe and took Pentecostalism into places it had never ever been, and it became a worldwide force that now they talk of it as being the third force in Christendom. It's so, Pentecostalism is so extensive. But when did it start? It started with the visit of an angel to a man with a commission from God to bring to the nations a word. Amen.